Just waiting for it to load. Okay, it looks like we're live. Hello, welcome. So if you're here, if you could just say hi, let me know, let me feel your presence, that would be great. For those who are new to this adventure, I'm Michael Smith. In some corners of the internet, I'm sometimes called Morphenius, or once upon a time, I was also known as Valentine, if you get the reference, and kudos to you, science fiction geek. So I'm going to give a quick context for what this series is about. I don't require anybody to have seen previous series. I intend these to be episodic, so you can take any given instance. But in these weekly live streams here, I'm wanting to offer something like one of my gifts, just because it's fun to give, it's pleasurable to offer. I'm giving some context on ways of seeing the world, to see what the forces are that actually shape how we make decisions, how current events are unfolding, and why, what some of the context is for that, some of the historical emphasis of it. Part of the point of this is that these are not about just ideas. These are not facts to learn. A lot of history is taught very dryly. So honestly, like my background is in mathematics education. So a lot for me is that math is taught really flatly in a similar way, alienating unnecessarily, for a certain definition of unnecessary. So I don't mean to say, I'm going to teach you things about history. I'm going to show up if you love history. It has nothing to do with it. There's the important thing is that history lives inside each of us. There is a movement of the past and a movement of ideas and currents that actually shape how we move, how we talk to each other, what things we find interesting, what things we find alarming. I keep referring to them as threads. They're memetic threads. Memetic meaning something like genetic, but for ideas. They are ideas and behavior patterns. There are these movements that, when you learn how to see them, give a larger context for why things unfold the way they do, and how that unfolding actually affects you on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute level. Why it is that certain things grip your attention, why it is that certain jobs seem appealing and others don't. It's going to vary from one person to another, but there is a larger context for all these things. And if from my years of habit of trying to save the world with all kinds of like running companies and trying to do social movements, and like if I were still on a save the world, like, oh God, have to do this, the direction to emphasize here would be something like the ability for humanity to orient to its major problems, things like climate change, or what we're doing with technology, or political fracturing, the potential, like the instability and potential collapse of different supply chains. In order to orient these in a sane and kind way, we have to know about these forces, not as facts to learn, but as something we touch and experience. Memetic literacy is an absolute must for a conscious human race. Of course, it's just my opinion, but I'm right. So, see, okay. So for today's session, I want to share about a sort of hidden thread in history. Now, when I talk about history, I mostly focus on Western history, and I feel like I need to make a mention of this because we live in postmodern times, even if most people don't know what that means. But there's a kind of bias that, or it's a meta bias that shows up of, hey, why am I focusing so much on Western history and a Western context? Well, for one thing, it's because it's what I'm expert in. It's one of the things that I know a lot about. I can't say a whole lot about the history of China or the history of Africa. I don't know about pre-European American history very well at all. There's a lot that I'm just missing. But there's also the fact that, like, regardless of our opinion about whether it should have happened or not, Europe did, in practice, colonize the world. And its idea structures, in large part through modern America, ended up dominating a lot of the infrastructure, the emotional and social infrastructure, rather than technical or physical infrastructure. And a lot of the social ideas and implicit assumptions that we have about how people work and what kinds of things count as conversations and what problems are worth solving, that is predominantly a Western context. So I find it incredibly helpful to examine what is this particular sort of almost like an operating system. What's this operating system that's running humanity? It's really important to be able to observe that clearly. So for today, I want to look at a thread that runs through Western history and still affects us today vividly, but that we don't recognize and usually isn't talked about, or when it's talked about, it's sort of dismissed, and it's rare to see the connection that lines things through. So when I'm talking about lining things through, a quick example that we are very familiar with, for the most part, is Christianity. Or maybe even reaching farther back, you could talk about the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And those we can see the effects of very clearly. Some sort of vague idea of, like, I think, I'm not sure how much mainstream is aware of this, but there's kind of a general thrust that goes something like, the Bible talks about what the Jews did in ancient times, and then there was Jesus, and then we had Christianity for a long time. If that's your understanding of that arc of history, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. It gives enough context. And then you can see a lot of effects of Christianity on the way that we structure everything today, in terms of, why is religion a thing that when we talk about freedom of religion, or we talk about you are not going to be discriminated against based on religion, sex, race, sexual orientation, political beliefs, why is religion included in there? This doesn't seem to be necessary in orienting to Buddhism versus Taoism. They're not at each other's throats, as far as I know. So what's going on there? And it turns out what's going on there is a particular memetic mutation, a particular variation that showed up with kind of laterish Christianity that you also see in parts of Islam. I think you see something that's almost the opposite in Judaism. It's interesting. But there's a thread where the need to convert, the need to cause conversion, becomes part of the a very particular flavor. Like Buddhism has something similar, but it's not aggressive in the same way, at least not in the versions that I've usually encountered. So this need to convert results in this sense of, oh, there's something dangerous here. We still feel that today. Also feel it in things like the hours that different shops are open, particularly in the United States, are likely to be different on Sundays. Why? Well, it was related to both the fact that people needed time to be able to go to church in the morning on Sundays, and also in observance of the commandment to rest on the seventh day. The seventh day originally was Saturday. That was originally the Sabbath. And for a whole bunch of reasons, which in fact relate to today's core topic, we ended up moving it to Sunday. So that's why church is on Sundays instead of Saturdays. Okay. But so if you sort of observe the arc of history, when I say the arc of history, I'm talking about noticing not just what does history say, but like there are very specific lines of influence that when you look around today, you can see these influences. Another form with which you can see the thread of Christianity is the focus on love. Our modern ideas about that love conquers all, love is the most powerful force in the universe, that it's important to cultivate a capacity for love, that forgiveness is essential, that being a virtuous person is somehow tied to being kind. There are similar ideas in the East, but it's, at least in Buddhist traditions, there's an element of, it's not because it's important to do in some abstract way, it's because the cultivation of loving kindness, of metta, is a very helpful part of the awakening process. And here I'm describing things in terms of sort of Theravadan ways of talking, like it's easier to awaken and open. It's a little more emphasized in Mahayana, a more widespread version of Buddhism that emphasizes the need for loving kindness as the way, as a potential entire path to awakening. Okay. So, but the way, the emphasis on particularly romantic love, that somehow there's this odd thing of you should love all children. Also, love of a partner and a love for a partner is somehow extra special in a very particular way. What's that about? It actually comes from Christianity. So we see this baked into films and into our stories and into the ways that we talk and into what resonates, what's intuitively right, even for people who have eschewed anything having to do with monotheism or Christianity or religion in general. You'll still find these threads, right? So knowing some of this context gives you a sense of, well, why do you intuit the things you do? Some of it's going to be because it's true, but some of it is because there is a historical context that is living in your body and mind. So that's an example of a thread of history that we're actually pretty familiar with. We know a lot about, right? The the fact that we have printed books is thanks to the need to spread the Bible. And if we had a less book and language focused religion defining the arc of European history, of European belief systems and meaning making, then we might not have widespread literacy the way we do, and we might not have been able to have the information age, the computers. So like there's a lot here. There's a lot here when you learn how to feel these pieces. So what I want to talk about today is a hidden thread. It's not that hidden. It really isn't. But it's not talked about, and it's not considered to be one thread. But it is very clearly one thread when you learn how to see it. So some quick examples of this, the way that it appears today. So one example is in, science is a huge, very present example. The power of science, the way that science got the, like when people talk about believe the science, they're actually borrowing from the what the collective attitude towards the church used to be. I don't mean to dismiss anything here. I'm just highlighting this is some of the energetics, some of the implicit structures behind the attitudes towards science. The idea that that scientists are sort of the priests of truth. And this shows up in terms of the way that various groups will want to appeal to science, like quantum mysticism. Like quantum mechanics shows that consciousness creates a reality. And so and that everything is made of vibration. So if you just vibrate at the frequency of what you desire, then that will bring you what you want. You're not noticing, first off, that that idea is a very watered down concept of a nuanced and it's super, it's actually a very potent principle in Hermeticism, which is the closest thing we have to, it's actually the origin of the concept of real magic. Okay. So it's watered down. And the reason it's watered down is because there's a loss of connection to this particular memetic thread. But the reason for the appeal to science is because um, we have, for the most part, as a culture, we have deeply practiced sourcing our knowing to a priesthood. So, and the priests of truth, the priests of reality, are scientists. So there's a need for science, almost like this monolithic father figure, to approve of the spirituality that we want to believe in and that resonates in our hearts, even though we don't know why it resonates. We assume the resonance is truth. But in many cases, it's familiarity and hope. It's very different. It can be related. I'm not saying these things are false either, but I'm highlighting that the reason to believe in something, there are lots of reasons to believe in something, and it's worth tracking the difference between it being true and it being familiar. So the science itself, the actual power of science, its ability to affect the physical world through its technologies, through its insights, this actually derives directly from some older things. There's this sort of story. You see this in chemistry, for instance. The story of chemistry, even like it's even in the name chemistry. It's this is a fun little twist on the nature of being here. But so chemistry acknowledges that it came out of alchemy. And that's part of where the name link comes from. Alchemy, if you drop off the al part, which is an Arabic prefix, same as algebra and algorithm. The al part basically means the. So we got a lot of this stuff from the Arabs, specifically from the sort of Islamic empire. There was a name for it. Yep, mine's dropping the name. That's okay. Anyway, there's a whole arc here having to do with the fact that a lot of Western traditions ended up being preserved by Islam. So a lot of our names and ideas actually went through some of the spiritual memetic threads of the Near East. It's just that it went through the memetic threads of the Near East in a way that was itself derived from the same thread as Christianity. So you get some interbreeding of ideas there. And because Islam came third, and it acknowledges Christ as a prophet. It just says that Muhammad is the last prophet and added these clarifications. And those clarifications ended up defining Islam. It's like the simplified version. So chemistry came from alchemy. And the idea is that basically the alchemy is stupid chemistry. That alchemists were not trying to understand the world or benefit others. They were just trying to figure out how to turn lead into gold or turn base metals into gold. And somehow this also gives them immortality. And like so this to me is one of the amazing examples of modern forgetfulness. You can see some of the pain that's in the modern idea. I referred to this in last week's session as the scar in the Western soul. This schism that exists between our lived experience and our sense of the sacred. And one way that you can see it here is, why did the alchemists view the conversion of base metals into gold and the attainment of immortality as connected? Where did that idea come from? Why did they think that? And for the most part, modern chemists are not interested in the question, even though it is why we have chemistry. A lot of the practices of chemistry, a lot of the ideas came from alchemists working with base materials and trying to figure out, how does the world actually work? Okay. Alchemy is part of this thread that I'm trying to highlight here. Okay. But, so I'm going to take a minute to explain some things about alchemy, actual alchemy. So it's worth bearing in mind that with the European Enlightenment, this would have been about the 1700s, there was this split that occurred. I mean, it had already been starting. It was already pulling to a significant degree. This existed in Christianity. It was actually inherited through Neoplatonism. Okay. And this idea of the kingdom of heaven is what matters. Your work here only matters to the extent that, depending on how you want to phrase it, but today it might be something like to the extent that it pleases God. But this mortal coil is just a transition. And the thing for you to attend to is the eternal afterlife. Do you want the eternal afterlife to be with God in heaven? Or do you want it to be in hell? Now, the thing about hell as a place of punishment, that evolved later. It evolved significantly later. It was not the main emphasis. But the thing I want to highlight is that there was already this pull, like, let's discard the flesh in order to attain the higher world. This disdain for matter was already a thread in Christianity. I'd have to look this up, but I think the attitude was there by the fall of Rome. And it was definitely pretty well established by around the year 1000, in that ballpark. By the way, for some mental hangers, by the way, I found this just super helpful for being able to track, can I have any hangers at all for how any of this happened? Very useful like timeline here is, this is fake. This is courtesy of Rick Steves, who created Europe Through the Back Door, which is a tour company. And he just gave this lecture when I was a teenager. It stuck in my head. It was super helpful. And I'm going to give the super compressed version. You can think of the Roman Empire as existing from 500 BC to 500 AD. Not exactly right, but whatever. 500 BC to 500 AD. Exactly straddling Christ. Okay. And then 500 AD to 1500 AD. Like, so this is 1,000 years, here's another 1,000 years. 500 AD to 1500 AD is the Middle Ages. Okay. Then 1500 to 1700, just a 200-year period, is the Renaissance. This is the creation of all this art, and this, like, Renaissance literally means rebirth. And where this came from is an important element here. And then we start going by individual centuries. Right? The 1700s was the European Enlightenment. The 1800s was the Romantic movement, which is where we get our modern ideas of romance from. It's worth tracking. There's something interesting here about them. Like, what does it have to do with Rome and being Roman? The Romantic movement. There's something relevant there. And then when you get into the 1900s, that's the 20th century, and that feels more like modern history. And then it often makes sense to start breaking it down in terms of decades at that point. So just with that framework, 500 BC to 500 AD was the Roman Empire, 500 AD to 1500 AD is the Middle Ages. This is the peak time of Christianity and the Catholic Church. Right? That's like pretty good. So right around the transition between Rome and the Middle Ages, there was a pivot in terms of the structure of Christianity, largely thanks to St. Augustine. And what I'm saying is, by halfway through the Middle Ages, there was this escape the body attitude. And I think it was there quite a bit earlier. There's some details missing in my exact perception there. Okay. So this, but in the Enlightenment, in the 1700s, there was sort of a completion saying, look, religion keeps promising this upper world, but let's disregard that. Let's acknowledge that there is no upper world. There's just this world. This did some pretty significant damage to the Western ability to make meaning. I talk about that quite a lot in last week's session. But the upshot is that if there is nothing greater to aspire to, then what's it for? What's it all for? Like this I think is the core sort of meta thread that I actually want to change tacks a little bit and emphasize. There's something really pivotal and key about our ability to make sense of things outside of the framework that we're used to making sense of things. That's sounds kind of messy, but the usual, like a sort of intuitive way that this feels, sort of a way that resonates with our subjective experience, is that life needs to be meaningful. If you don't have something meaningful to work towards or to work with or on, there's a kind of blah that sort of descends. And you end up with either distraction, like you have to distract yourself with entertainment and busy work so that you don't think about the fact that life is meaningless, or you end up with nihilism and depression. Nihilism doesn't necessarily require depression, but there is a kind of yes, the everything bagel is freeing. For those who have seen Everything Everywhere All at Once, the film. But there's also obviously something missing. There's something important missing. In fact, what's missing is importance itself. So humans seem to need this, and it's not just some kind of random extra nutrient, like, oh, we need meaning, like we need protein. It is actually basic to the ability to orient to reality and the ability to like, it's actually core to the process that we used as infants to be able to create our concept of an object to begin with, so that we could have object permanence and be able to see things as things. Our capacity to do this is built out of the machinery that, as our worldview becomes more complex, we experience as the need for meaning. So it's not just some sort of abstract nutrient. We don't need meaning in addition to other things. It permeates the process of orienting to anything at all. Professor John Vervaeke gives a wonderful lecture series if you feel like spending 25 to 50 hours listening to it. I think it's worth it. It's got some beautiful stuff in there. Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, free YouTube series. So there's a question of, so from a Western arc, I mean, this is like a general human arc. The same thing is true in the East. It's true everywhere. But emphasizing this particular thread of history, when we alienated ourselves from the possibility of an upper world, we were left floundering, because what's it for? What we tried to replace it with is this basically a pursuit of knowledge and power. But it's not knowledge in the sense of gnosis. It's not the knowledge in the same sense as knowledge of God, or knowledge of a deeper sense of our reality, or or know thyself, ancient Greek stuff, which has echoes in the recognition of the separately abiding self as an illusion, and the direct knowledge of that as a source of freedom from Buddhism. So I don't mean that kind of knowledge. I mean things like chemical knowledge. Like, when you put these chemicals together and you heat them, there is an effect. And that effect creates these kinds of things. Like like when you burn hydrogen in an atmosphere of oxygen, you get an explosive reaction, and then out of that you get water. And here's the chemical reason why. Brandon Clearwater is asking, if you don't have meaning with something, you may not be oriented to it, except perhaps on a superficial, trivial level. Yeah, I think it's something like that. Like Vervaeke highlights this in terms of what does he call it? Relevance and relevance realization process. Like, in order for me to be able to pick up this teacup, I need to recognize that my wanting tea is somehow related to the teacup, and it's not related to the houses outside. How do I notice that? It can't be because there's some sort of embedded information structure. I may be using that, but there's a kind of recursive problem that it's not fresh on the top of my mind at the moment, but there's a recursive problem of how would you build that information structure in the first place if you didn't already know what was or wasn't relevant. So relevance realization has to be deeper than even the things that allow us to know how to do something as simple as pick up a cup. That relevance realization is intertwined with, and in many, I think it's basically the same thing as the question of meaning. What does this mean to me? What does it mean for the things I care about? So yeah, it runs all the way down into how do I pick up a cup? How do I walk across the room? Also, why do I walk across the room? I notice myself drifting into a little bit more mind space than I want to in a moment. Okay. So the need for meaning shows up with one way to produce a meaning making system. Like to have a meaning making system, you need something kind of like an engine, like a system, a way of orienting that feels like it answers the confusion and the wonder and the disorientation. So in Christianity, this shows up as, like, you can see sort of the three parts. The three parts, I've described this in some other videos, just not in this series yet. One part is the need for a coherent worldview, a way to make sense of the world. The second part is a relationship to the arc of time, that there is a long past and a future that is related to, that is part of the vision for what this system is about. And the third piece is a way that you personally can participate in the meaningful arc of history. So in Christianity, this shows up as there is a physical world, and then there is a higher world. In many variations, there's an emphasis on the lower world. The lower world shows up in a lot of traditions as well, including shamanic traditions that have nothing to do with Christianity. It keeps getting reinvented. The higher world, the lower world, and the middle world. Midgard, Asgard, and Jotunheim, for instance. So there is this world and there is the higher world, and it is all governed by God. And everything makes sense as part of God's plan, but God's plan has a kind of mystery to it. And there is a historical arc through Christ and through Christ's church, through Peter upon this rock, which is a pun, by the way. Peter is related to petrified. So when Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church," it was something like a pun. Like, on this Peter I will build my church. So and so the idea is that there is this long past that is described in the Bible, the Old Testament transitioning to the New Testament, of Christ and the descendants of the intellectual and memetic descendants of the apostles, such that all the way to the priest who is giving you the communion wafer and the wine today has the phrase that's coming to mind is mandate of heaven. That isn't quite like it's referring to something else, but it has this sort of connection to the higher world, so that you can see through the flow of history and to the potential future where there is the second coming of Christ and the potential end of the middle world, the end of the earthly world, and that your work towards accepting your salvation and attuning to Christ allows you to be saved. Well, the savior stuff was this showed up more strongly with Protestantism. In Catholicism, I don't think saviorism is quite as strong, if I remember right. And the way that you participate is you obey the church and you show up to Mass once a week. You do your prayers. Like, there's a couple of like just a couple of things that you do here. Like in Catholicism, there's this bit with confession. So confessionals to allow your sins to be forgiven by somebody who has the mandate of heaven. Again, the lineage. It has the lineage. Okay. So this is an example of a meaning-making system, and this particular one was strong enough that it allowed Christendom to rule for 1,000 years. But there's an older one that a lot of Christianity is actually, the ability for Christianity to create this worldview is actually built on. I noticed originally it was my intent to focus primarily on this, and I'm 35 minutes in, and I haven't really dug into this yet. I just touched on it by mentioning alchemy. So parallel to all of this, there is this arc that, as far as we can tell, so it started out from a mixture of Egypt and Babylon. It looks like it may have started older than that. The Egyptians insist that they got it from a civilization before theirs, but historians insist this is not the case, which is kind of an interesting debate. But part of their, a couple of the practices that these were pulling together ended up converging and synthesizing into a system in Hellenistic Alexandria. Hellenistic Hellenica is, or something like that, is Greek for Greek. Helen of Troy was the Greek lady in Troy. So Hellenistic is a reference to Greek. So what it means for, so we're talking about the Hellenistic period, we're talking about a period when Greece had command over a large portion of the world because of Alexander the Great. So Hellenistic Alexandria was based in Egypt. Pretend this is around 500 BC. It's not quite right, but it's pretty close. It's close enough. It's closer to 500 BC than now. But it was at the dawn of the Roman Empire. Right? This is before the Roman Empired. And Alexander, after he Alexandered over the world, over the known world, and sort of took it over, he insisted on compiling the knowledge of the known world into one place. This was the Library of Alexandria. And Alexandria was this intellectual hub. So that was where several different idea threads synthesized the first time that we're aware of in the arc of modern history. This is where we get astrology as we know it today, which created astronomy. There wasn't a distinction between astrology and astronomy. It was about, let's look at the stars, let's orient to the stars and make sense of them. And there's a recognition that there is a resonance between what's going on Earth and what's going on in the stars. I'll get to that in a moment. So, this is part of the pivot I was mentioning before about the Enlightenment. So astrology was created as a synthesized system at that time, as was alchemy. The chemi part, if you look up stuff like Hermetism and the Hermetic tree of life, you'll be able to trace this back. It comes from an Egyptian word. I don't know the original Egyptian word, but it basically means black. It's a reference to the color of the soil around, or at least we think so. Our current best guess about where this is coming from is that it is a reference to the color of the soil around a particular part of Egypt. And so saying, we come from where the soil is black, we come from the black place, right? We come from Kemia. So the practices, the discipline that was created around Kemia became the Kemia practice. It wasn't called alchemy at that time. What happened was that the art got lost for a while to the West, but the Arabs ended up continuing the practice of the Kemetic arts. So they called it the Kemetic, or the Kemetic arts, or alchemy. So alchemy and astronomy, and what was at the time, I believe the word for this was some version of theurgy. I don't know what the original Greek was, but it was something like theurgy, which had to do with the transformation of your person into its immortal form. as a living God. Okay. So this got synthesized into a bunch of writings that, one of the main pen names used for this, and I say it's a pen name because there's a lot of evidence that multiple people used this pen name, particularly over the course of centuries. And the main pen name for this was Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. And I don't know why he's thrice great. This is some detail that I'm missing here. But this, when we talk about Hermeticism, it's a reference to the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. There's an interesting ambiguity here about, well, is Hermes Trismegistus the same as, different from Hermes, the Greek god, messenger god, the one that in Rome is known as Mercury? Unclear. But I want to fast forward from that pivot point. There are a couple of transitions that happened here. So we actually lost contact with Hermeticism for a long time. With the fall of Rome, there was a big kind of there was a kind of meaningful transition, and for political reasons, Christianity took the role of being a meaning-making system. The Hermetic meaning-making system had a kind of coherence then, but it's not entirely clear what all of the components were. But it was very clear what the components were by the time it was reintroduced in the Renaissance. This is the 1600s. You're fast forwarding 1,000 years, a little over 1,000 years. It was a little earlier than that. It was more like the 1400s, but call it 1500. Renaissance started in 1500. So when these got reintroduced via the Near East, we ended up with the seeds of a shift. Now it's noticing noticing a way in which this is. I'm feeling a little embarrassed because I feel like I'm not quite doing this justice, because there's a bunch of different components that I want to share. But it turns out, oh, I need to give all of these pieces for the way that at least I orient to this context. But a way to track this is that for 1,000 years, the 1,000 years of Christendom, there was a kind of basic sameness. Like there were some shifts and transitions, some evolutions of thought, but it all happened very much within the context of Christendom, Christianity. There wasn't a transformation of perspective that challenged the basic idea of, we are on earth, there is heaven. Your task is to make it so that your immortal soul goes to heaven in good relationship with the Lord. And you do that by adherence to the teachings of the church, which has the credentialing from Christ, who is God in some paradoxical way. So this that didn't change for 1,000 years, and then all of a sudden at the Renaissance everything exploded. Why? Well, the main reason, best as I can tell, like people can debate this back and forth, but I think an easy way to think about this is the Black Death. The Black Death wiped out huge swaths of the population there. Now, there's something important here to bear in mind, that this sounds like a story, right? This sounds like these things happened, and that's why things are the way they are today. That's part of what I'm accounting for. I'm noticing a way that I seem to have slotted into something energetically that isn't quite where I meant to land. But the thing to track here is not these are ideas, right, or that this is some story. It's that this stuff lives in us. Okay. So, and it lives in us today. The echo of the Black Death shows up today in the kind of, like we had 1,000 years of a meaning-making system that worked for giving us a way to orient. We weren't confused about what we were doing. A lot of things sucked relative to what we're capable of today. it was hard to make any meaningful progress because of the stranglehold that the church had on the capacity for new forms of thinking. But also a lot of the thinking that did happen was because of the church. The church facilitated things that that wouldn't have been available otherwise. A lot of the preserved writing, like the literacy, is thanks to the church. Like the church preserved literacy and encouraged its clergy to learn how to read and write so that it could copy the Bible and so that it could read from the Bible. Right? So there's a lot here of like how the church held things. But the Black Death didn't discriminate between people in the clergy, and it wiped out a lot of the social infrastructure in the same kind of way that COVID today really disturbed the supply chains and our trust in institutions. Can you imagine if COVID had something more like a 40% death rate? Like it had somewhere in the ballpark of, like, it was less than 1%. I think it might have been 0.1%, something like that. The information is hard to get, but it was not anywhere near the severity of Black Death. Not even vaguely close. If this had been on Black Death levels of pandemic horror, our civilization would have been brought to its knees. The entire concept of what are we even doing? Like all of the, like, there would be so much fragmentation. There wouldn't be global infrastructure of supplies. There wouldn't be supply chains anymore. Medieval Europe had an advantage in that it wasn't safe to travel long distances, so they didn't have cross-continental supply chains. So there weren't supply chains to break down. Your food was local, which meant that you were at risk of famines instead. But so they didn't have as bad a supply chain breakdown, but there was a kind of trust breakdown. If we're doing all this meaningful stuff and we're in the good graces of God, why are we being destroyed? Why are the priests and the monks and so on as susceptible to this wickedness as we are? Did we lose God's approval? Like what's going on? See, Brandon mentioning something like a horrible plague would probably cause lots of people to question how they look at the world. They might think how they were living wasn't in tune with how they needed to live fruitfully in the world. Yeah. So we still have echoes of this force today, this thing of what now? The way that it's shown up now is we don't trust meaning-making systems. We don't trust them, which is an interesting puzzle to have. But a lot of that lack of trust is thanks to the 20th century, not just the Black Plague. What the Black Plague did is it disrupted our ability to trust institutions as the source of meaning. It caused us to recognize that we need to search for meaning on some level. And that's what inspired the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a rebirth because it rebirthed a lot of the ancient wisdom prior to the domination of the Christian meaning-making system. So with the Renaissance, what exactly was the rebirth? They were bringing in elements of ancient thought and recaptured things having to do with alchemy. Astrology had already been sort of hovering in the background, but it wasn't a big thing during the arc of Christendom, right? Because like it refers explicitly to gods, to Mercury and to Mars and to Saturn. And it's referring to the influence of the gods. Part of in order to understand what was introduced, it's really important to understand that there was the massive shift that happened with the Enlightenment. We severed, I mean, it wasn't just the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment really started it, and it was really solid by the mid-1800s. Really solid, which was this severing of the experiencer from the experienced. The idea that I can observe something, I can look at something, and my observation is not a part of the system that is this. that lets me examine it like an object that is disconnected from me and find out facts about it. And then I can come to understand exactly how this works and leave myself unaffected, except that now I know a little bit more. This is so foundational, so utterly foundational to our modern way of orienting to the world that we don't even notice. It is the fundamental tenet of, or tenet, tenant is different. It's the fundamental tenet of modern materialism. Only in the severing of the observer from the observed, there's also kind of this thing of, yeah, and also there's no observer, not really, which incidentally starts to stumble towards something really interesting. But the prior to this cut, there was this attitude that my observing the cup and the observations of the cup are deeply intertwined. So when I turn the cup, I'm actually transforming myself. I transform myself not just by, oh, I am receiving information about the rotation of the cup, but what was involved in the process of me being able to touch the cup and rotate it. Who am I now that I see something different about the cup? And I am transforming as the cup transforms. And my capacity to transform the cup comes from my ability to shift myself. For instance, where does the choice to reach my hand forward come from? Notice that it is my hand that rotates the cup. How am I acting through my hand? When I touch the cup, how do I know I am touching the cup? I am experiencing it. So there's this deep intertwining, a fitting with, which is the original, or shaping to, or shaping with, which is the original meaning of conform. This is a part of, this is Latinized later into conform, but this is part of Aristotle's theory of conformity, his theory of knowledge as conformity, is to fit with, that my knowing the cup is the way in which my fingers know how to wrap around the cup and to be in contact with it. So this deep intertwining was fundamental to the world prior to the modern era that really started with the Enlightenment. Okay. So when we look at something like alchemy, what was alchemy doing? Why is the transforming the base metals of lead into gold, or base metals into golds, right? The transformation of base metals into gold. What does that have to do with immortality? Well, it's that you are intertwined with whatever you are doing. So it is not actually about turning metals into gold. That is a metaphor. There's also like a literal attempt, because if you could turn things into gold, that would be pretty awesome. Like a lot of people were very serious about physically doing this, but it didn't have the disconnect of how we would do it today. In fact, the alchemists had a term for people who made this mistake and were only interested in the physical world. They were called charcoal burners, and it was a derogatory term. It was like moron. These people don't get what's relevant. The alchemists had a similar attitude to those who became chemists as the modern chemists do to the alchemists. Because alchemists viewed the point of the practice as the cultivation of wisdom. Wisdom being this element of, how do I come to see truth more deeply? How do I come to be fitted to truth? Truth is not information in my head. Truth is something that as I come into contact with it and as I become it, I am transformed. So the turning of base metals into gold is because of the intention of turning this base metal into gold, which is the creation of an immortal soul. And this is something that we've largely lost in our modern ways of talking about any of this. The idea that the soul is eternal. Well, if it's eternal, like what was created? Once it's created, it's here forever. Exactly how does this work? in in the meaning-making system that evolved in sort of I want to say like neo-Hermeticism. It really came together in sort of a second proper rebirth at with the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn at the turn of the 20th century. They synthesized all of these different pieces together and tried to make a system out of it. I see Brandon mentions maybe the Black Plague caused a lot of fear of the outer world, and so people withdrew from it to analyze it from a safe distance. Yeah, that's possible too. I think the disembodied stuff was there before. I think it was there before. I'll come back to that, and I can say some things about it. So the Hermetic meaning-making system goes something like this. You are the center. Right there. There's a little confusion about this because in the classical element, there was actually the sense of the earth is the center. And that is part of how you make sense of the cosmos. But I'm editing this just a little bit to highlight it. You are the center. You can see this, right? If you look around, where is the center of experience? It's right there. In the process of consciousness coming into the physical world creates the physical world because the two are fitted, they are connected. When you do that, you can't help but leave echoes of the process of your incarnation in the structure of reality. Excuse me. So it is not like there is some other God, although there is, but isn't. It's held as paradoxical in the background. But it's rather that your consciousness is divinity. And that, the true you, is reaching through this form into reality, and into the physical reality, I should say. So you'll see these echoes in things like the structure of the stars. You will also see them in the structure of material and in matter. You'll see it in the structure of your mind. There's this fractal reflection that happens everywhere. So the way that this version of Hermeticism would view what's currently going on in the world is, okay, so there's this kind of kerfluffle of activity and anxiety, and how are we going to deal with all of these chaotic problems, and oh no, there's doom. The thing that Hermeticism emphasizes is, how is this reflected within? Or rather, what is this a reflection of? As though there's a true reflection. That isn't quite correct. You could describe it as, how is this reflecting something about my process of incarnating and being conscious of my true nature? Of the process of me, in particular, of constructing an immortal self, or discovering my immortal self, depending on what angle you want to put this on. There's some stuff having to do with time that makes this complicated. But this business of, how does this refer to and reflect my work, my inner work? So here you can start to see how the worldview, and a way of starting to make sense of the world, refers to this business of participation. How do I participate? Then what is the arc of time? So the arc of time being like this becomes very self-referential, and is a little messy to say. I am noticing, in fact, that I'm coming up on the hour for this. I'm okay going over an hour, but I'm noticing that this particular thread, today's thread, was a lot more messy than I had hoped, and I didn't focus as much on Hermeticism as I would have liked. But okay, good. I have a new little teapot here that I'm using to keep my tea warm in between smaller cups, and it's not quite as warm as I'd expected. So anyway, I may end up breaking this down and focusing on smaller segments. So I didn't get to a lot of the things that are so potent today about where science is coming from. I may have to focus on very smaller um, portions for future iterations of this. So, okay, so how do I want to tie this together? Rather than trying to give the whole engine in fast forward, I think I want to just point out a few things that are descendants of this. Just very quickly point out some things that we actually feel from this systemization of Hermeticism, the way that this came together. Although I want to emphasize the fact that these threads are older than Hermeticism, they're quite a bit older. So one example is when you look at things like Harry Potter, or the fantasy genre in general, but like Harry Potter in particular is a very vivid example of this. Why does it resonate so much with people? Why was there Potter mania? Why is there a genre of fantasy such that Tolkien's work, The Lord of the Rings, resonates? It seems to speak to something. It's a type of thing. It's coherent in that particular way. It's not just, oh, this is a reference to the Middle Ages. It's not about historical fiction. The magic is important. What is that referring to? Science fiction is the same thing. This is part of the reason why people have difficulty sorting out the difference between science fiction and fantasy. There's an aesthetic difference that shows up, but the aesthetic difference has to do with how much it's in touch with the charcoal burners way of orienting to matter. How much, like in an important way, Star Trek is just as magical as Lord of the Rings. Like when they come up with these completely gobbledygook explanations of, oh, like our flux capacitor is starting to vent some antimatter into the relay system, and that's causing blah blah. It's like you're just saying associated words. Like, what does this actually mean? It doesn't mean anything because they don't have the tech. They can't describe it coherently. But it sounds kind of like what engineers would say, because engineering is another heir of Hermeticism. It's a little heretical, but it's true. So I may go into this in more detail in another run through. I want to focus specifically on what Isaac Newton did, what Isaac Newton's magic spell was. So it was pretty blatantly and explicitly an act of magic what he did. And like he was an alchemist. He was a practicing alchemist. I don't mean this metaphorically. I mean it quite literally. He was an alchemist and a gematriist, which is to say that he believed in the numerology of words that is inherited through the Jewish practice of gematria, to correspond Hebrew letters and therefore words to numbers, and that there would be a synergy between things that had similar or related numerical connections. So when I say he was a practicing gematriist, he was trying to crack the Bible code, which is to say looking at the Hebrew version of the Bible and trying to sort out where in this text is there encoded information about the future and about true messages, where are there hidden correspondences. Which leads me to that on top of like science having emerged from this whole thread, like the Renaissance gave birth to science for the same reason it gave birth to then modern alchemy. It was exactly the same thing. In fact, like a lot of it, like chemistry is a descendant of alchemy, and physics. I mean, even the word physics is comes from the fact that Aristotle wrote a book called Nature, where he described the motion of everything in the physical world in terms of the four elements as concentric spheres, with things having a desire to move from one to the other, like the the sphere of earth is below the sphere of water, which is why rocks sink in water. But the sphere of air is above the sphere of water, which is why bubbles rise in water. And that this can be overwhelmed with intent, which is why you can throw a rock into the air, but it sort of runs out of intent over time, which is why it falls to the ground. This was the predominant theory of motion and how nature works for a long time, and basically until Newton, I mean, it was being questioned before then. Galileo pushed on this a fair bit and highlighted we don't know how things work. But until around the time of Galileo, which is like the middle of the Renaissance, this is our theory of motion. And the book that Aristotle wrote was called Nature, which in Greek is physikos. He also wrote a book after that called After Nature, where he described the motion of the cosmos as a fifth sphere and trying to describe the behavior of the stars and the larger context that we're all in. The name of that book was After Nature, which in Greek is metaphysikos, which is where we get metaphysics from. So, but the context of physics comes from there, and the worldview of concentric spheres where we're at the center. Right, that was part of the kind of context that we were living in. And like physics evolved from attempts to explore exactly how this works in correspondence with Hermetic principles. Like, Newton's Law of Gravitation was a very direct application of some of the Hermetic laws. As above, so below, as within, so without. So if that's true, how is the moon falling? Or how is the moon's movement the same as the force that has this apple fall? How do I unify heaven and earth into one vision? 20th century spirituality is a descendant of this. Our ideas of positive thinking, new thought, which evolved into this business of resonate with the future that you want. It evolved from this one thread. So there's a hidden thing which I'm noticing in the course of having tried to talk about this for an hour. And I may wrap up here and go, this didn't quite work, so I'm gonna have to go back and draft this again. But there is this hidden thread that is the source of Western power. Right? Science is a descendant of magic. There's no question. Right? Science, we find this objectionable. I mean, not like being described that way. No, we got past it. That's fine. You can have that attitude, but like you sort of created your own puzzle there. What you mean is you want nothing to do with the cultivation of wisdom that is part of the original context of magic. That's what you mean. You don't want any association with the development of an immortal soul, or any ideas like that there even could be a soul. There's some other world than the physical world, which itself was never the original idea. It got morphed into that largely courtesy of Thomas Aquinas. Anyway, there's a whole arc there. So when we look at things like the power to be able to turn on the light by flicking a switch, this is very directly connected to the practices of alchemy and astrology and theurgy. Thanks to the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn, this also has intertwining with something that is called the Kabbalah. Although the version of the Kabbalah that ended up getting intertwined with this, Kabbalists, and like Jewish Kabbalists, take exception to how the synthesis works. They say, that's not Kabbalah. Like, okay, great, that's not Kabbalah, it's Hermetic Kabbalah. That's great. The Kabbalistic tree of life. So these ideas permeate the all of the power practices. But one of the things that we're finding is that when you don't have the wisdom practices intertwined with the power ones, the power practices lose their potency over time. And potency is a very particular thing here. It's not just we can't run computers. Obviously, we can. But this shows up, for instance, in the way in which, like, if you think about who were the giants, who were the intellectual giants of the first half of the 20th century in science, you have Einstein, Niels Bohr, David Bohm. You had von Neumann. These are major paradigm shifting forces. They're not just people, they're forces in a very important way. And we're still learning the implications of these ideas that they were suggesting. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, right? These are some really, really big defining names. How about the second half of the 20th century? Richard Feynman, Stephen Hawking. Okay. If you're really, really into science, you might know some other names because of people who've made advances, but they didn't redefine reality for us. And in fact, neither did Feynman or Hawking. Carl Sagan, arguably, although he was more populist, that's not the word I mean. He was more of an entertainer, is what I want to say. He was for creating an interface between science and people. Like, you might as well list Bill Nye. Right? We aren't getting paradigm shifters anymore. Why aren't we getting paradigm shifters? Well, part of the reason is the shifting of paradigm is no longer the point. The point is something like, can we manipulate the physical world? And there's this narrowing of vision. It's vivid narrowing of vision. So this is another way of expressing what John Vervaeke refers to as the meaning crisis. We don't know how to relate to where we are, the context we're in a meaningful way. But there is a hint in this hidden thread. Okay. So what I think I want to do here is, no, I'm dissatisfied with this presentation. I want to think this is something like, I often don't know how something is going to work until I do it in front of people. So my inclination at this point is to note that, and then now I know some edits to do. I think that a lot of these things can be broken up into smaller pieces that I think will be easier to orient to in their smaller form, and you can feel the impact more vividly. In particular, I think that it's really helpful to have, like, what I might do, like, it depends on how I feel over the next couple of days, but what I might do is do kind of a survey of modern meaning-making efforts, various cults and different factions of Christianity and spiritual things like Law of Attraction and quantum mysticism. Like, take a couple of these and highlight, what is this doing and why is it behaving the way that it is? Where does this come from? I think that that's a very potent lens for noticing part of why our collective attention gets as scattered as it does. When we're trying, like, if you don't have a meaning-making system, then what happens is you're back to this choice. Do you go for shattered distraction, or do you go for nihilistic despair? And if those are your options, by and large, we can keep getting this distraction appearing, and we will take whatever distraction is fed to us. The distraction works best if it's fragmented, if it's explosive, if it keeps changing, which is part of why the news cycle works the way it does today. It's appealing to an attempt to escape a very specific problem that we don't even have a name for, although it's starting to. This is the meaning crisis. But if you see it clearly, you can actually pause and go, wait, dude, I don't need to be part of the meaning crisis. But that requires you to have a meaningful way of orienting to large questions into the context of what's going on. So I'll play with this and give it some thought and see if there's a way to take all of this and sort of break it down and simplify it a little bit. So Brandon mentioning that I didn't find any meaning in the death of Jesus until I considered that it was about being able to face tragedy with grace rather than having it shatter oneself. Yeah. He, he I've encountered an interesting claim that fits with a bunch of other pieces, so I'll offer it to you, bearing in mind, I don't know if this is true, but I have heard that through much of Christendom, through the Middle Ages, the emphasis was not on Christ's sacrifice, that rather the emphasis was that Christ had offered a way. There's actually more of an emphasis on Christ's teachings. Or I may have the time period mixed up. This may have been prior to the fall of Rome. I'll have to look it up, but it was definitely, if it hadn't appeared by the time of Protestantism, it was definitely courtesy of John Calvin, for sure. A lot of the idea of Christ died for your sins, you horrible being, because you are so sinful. Right? That whole attitude, that is straight out of Calvinism. So the emphasis on Christ's death was considered more like one of the mysteries to behold, and part of how you transform in your relationship to the divine. But yeah, being able to face tragedy with grace, that's a beautiful way of saying it. The emphasis on oh God, why have you forsaken me? The sense of despair in the midst of suffering. There's actually a lot of beauty in Christianity as a wisdom tradition. There's a way where a lot of it could, in principle, be recovered. That's not my own personal main project, but I see how to do it. I see how to do it with fidelity, with respect, and with divinity. There's a way to recover any of these systems. It's just that we have to mature past our cultural enlightenment assumptions of where what a religion has to be, what a meaning-making system has to be. We got some pretty distorted ideas, so I'm sure I'll end up talking about that in future sessions. I know I said I would come back to this thing about maybe the Black Death caused a lot of fear of the outer world, and so people withdrew from it, channelized it from a safe distance. I'll just mention briefly that Thomas Aquinas was about 100 years before the Black Death, and he had already introduced a lot of this division between the physical and the spiritual. Like, I mean, he didn't introduce it; it was already there. But what he paved the way for the split to be more thorough by suggesting, originally prior to Thomas Aquinas, the idea. Thomas Aquinas, think 1200s, early 1200s, and the Black Death was mid to late 1300s. So prior to Thomas Aquinas, the idea was that the upper world is more real. The Neoplatonic ideas that they're still very alive in our culture, and they're still very alive in our assumptions. It's just that we have this scar in the Western soul that keeps us from seeing clearly what we're looking at. But probably the most blatant modern mythological presentation of this is the Matrix, where Neo, whose name is short for Neoplatonism, is also the One, which is a concept in Neoplatonism, and that you're in a fake world. Like the Matrix is fake. It's not the real world. The real world is somehow beyond the Matrix. And that once you get in contact with the real world, then your relationship to the world of illusion becomes deeply transformed. Interestingly enough, it's depicted in the Matrix. You become capable of magic. But it's not magic when you know how to do it, right? It's just programming or something, but it's magic. So these ideas are still very present in how we experience the world. But what Thomas Aquinas did was introduce the idea of maybe both of these worlds are real. The physical world is real and the spiritual world is real. And part of what he was trying to do was reconcile a collision he was observing between Aristotelian logic, which was part of the church, part of the ideas and teachings that they were encountering, and that a lot of their stuff was based on. They could see how the memetic threads led back to Aristotle. But they seem to contradict some of the teachings of the church. So how do you reconcile this? And Aquinas's solution was to say that reason and logic, he didn't say logic, but reason is the domain of the physical world, and that is real, but that that faith and the teachings of the church are in the domain of the spiritual world, which is also real, but also more important. But when he created that, there is something very quirky that arose, which is, well, if this is real too, how do I make sense of my suffering? How do I make sense of my difficulty? Why am I trying to leave this? Right? So in some sense, there was actually almost an opposite reaction as I'm reflecting on it. It took a couple hundred years, like the Black Death shook up the power structures. But what happened was that the mercantile class of Venice ended up getting to flourish, and which were disproportionately Jewish, because the Jews were able to money lend. Christians were banned from money lending, but that didn't apply to the Jews. So the Jews could charge interest for their for loans that they would get, and that let them create the foundation of our modern concept of economy. The modern concept of economy was approximately invented in the 1400s. So by the Jews, by the Jewish mercantile class. So there was a way in which a kind of focus on this world became the emphasis, because there was this sense of, well, if the church can't even protect us from what's going on in the physical world, is this higher world they're in contact with, like, does that even matter? I mean, I'm sure it matters because we all die and something happens after death, and obviously we go to this other world when we deal with that. But I mean, maybe we should make things good here now. So this was the start of materialism. So you actually see evidence of this planting the seeds of the banishment of the existence of a spiritual world in the wake of the Black Death. But like I said, it took a couple hundred years. So anyway, said I was going to say things about that, but I don't really have a lot to say. I'll just say this and then I rant for like 5 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes. So there we go. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to give some thought as to how to break this apart so that this is more digestible and feels more vivid. I don't just like this is a lot more. Here is information, and that isn't what I want this series to be. I want to highlight things that are alive in the present world. I want to make that more here. And the whole point is tying it to the here and now and into the embodied truth of what is. And I'm not satisfied with what I did with this. So I'm going to give this some thought and feel into what exactly the mechanics were that happened in me here. And and then in future sessions, you'll see the result of it. Hopefully this was still enjoyable. Like we got to have a sort of a bombarding of random ideas here. Yeah, I feel like there's another piece to say there, but I'm not quite sure what it is. So I will leave this here. Thank you for watching.